Hi there. Welcome to Utilising the VLE to Inform Assessment, Intervention and Progress, sponsored by BSME. My name is Michael Merrick. I'm the Deputy Head of Secondary at Qatar International School in Doha. Today, we have two fantastic speakers who are going to be sharing their knowledge. Firstly, will be Jean Kearns, who is the Chief Academic Officer at Renaissance, and then we will have Barry Bridie, who is the Assessment and Data Coordinator at Nord Anglia International School in Manila. I hope you enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jean Kearns. I am the Chief Academic Officer with Renaissance, and I'm excited to join you for this session where we will review some research that our company has done on the academic impacts of COVID. It's a series of reports that we title How Kids Are Performing. And then perhaps even more importantly than that, we will share with you a free tool that we refer to as Focus Skills, which really can be a powerful tool in addressing the academic impacts of COVID. Now, to be in contact with us, for those of you who are international outside of the US, the very best place to go to is Renaissance's international website, which is renlearn.co.uk, and the team there is prepared to support you in your needs. At Renaissance, we always like to begin by acknowledging our mission, which is to accelerate the learning for all children and adults worldwide, and is one of the world's largest providers of educational assessment. We often have the information to answer really important questions because in a typical year, students worldwide take over 80 million STAR assessments, which is our brand of reading and math assessments. And so we have a tremendous amount of information about how students are both performing and growing. So as people have begun to pose the question about what are the potential academic impacts of COVID, we've had a lot of information that we could use to answer that question. And so I want to share with you actually a series of reports driven off of US data that we title How Kids Are Performing. And you should also be aware that in the UK, Renaissance is working with several other groups, including the Department for Education, to replicate what I'm about to show you in even greater detail, looking at the performance of students in the UK. So a series of reports worldwide that begin to document the impacts of COVID, but we were able to move most quickly in the US market. So let's reveal to you what we found there, because it's highly likely that we see some very similar outcomes really worldwide. I'm actually able to share with you our latest version of the report, which we refer to as the winter edition. I'll explain why, that even though we're in the spring in the US, why we're just now seeing the winter edition. What is important is that How Kids Are Performing is the largest series of reports on the COVID slide. The winter edition looks, for example, at the assessment performance of over 3.8 million students who are very representative of the country as a whole because they came from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. As we begin, I'd like you to understand a little bit about the research design, because studying the academic impacts of COVID offers some fairly unique challenges. You see, historically, for those of you that follow research, you understand that in most studies there is a control group and there is an experimental group, and you've changed some type of variable for the experimental group that you have not changed for the control group. But if you think about this, there was no control group for this pandemic. The experimental group is every one of us in the entire world. We were all forced into this grand experiment called COVID, and there is no control group out there that we can compare our performance now against. And so even though it seems a simple thing to measure the academic impacts of COVID, it actually is a little bit challenging, again, because there is no control group outside. So in our report, what we define is academic impact as being a comparison to what was typical. So how are students comparing or performing now in comparison with how they would have typically performed. So the blue line represents here how students typically performed. And we know that. We have decades of data for millions of students. We know across the years of schooling how students typically grow. And along comes a pandemic, which, is a defining moment. And so in the first report that we released back in the fall, we were studying the period between the first set of dotted lines there. And what we found, really not surprising to anyone, is there was a drop in student performance. So students were entering this school year performing at a lower level than they had historically performed. There is the COVID impact. So in our first report, which is available in that same place, renaissance.com/performing, you were able to see the scale of the academic impacts from the beginning of the pandemic until students began the current academic year that we were in the United States. But once we understood that students started behind, the next important question for us to begin to answer is, how were they growing during the course of this academic year? And that's where the fall report transitions into the winter report, which studies the area between the next two dotted lines, because there's one of three potential outcomes. It could be that students are losing ground. We're falling further behind as time progresses. It could be that students are holding ground, that they began the year with some gaps, but we're growing them fairly nicely this year. Or it could be that students are falling further and further behind because schooling is so disrupted. And what I will tell you is we saw some of all of those things. We saw some instances where students were moving ahead. We saw some other instances where students were falling further behind. And we found some instances where students were holding their ground. So let's begin with some fairly good news. And that good news is that despite all the challenges that schools have faced this year, many students, not all, but many students have had a year that is fairly legitimate. So here's the first table from the report. It uses a score called the Student Growth Percentile, SGP for short. And it is a comparative score about growth. The scale ranges from 1 to 99, where 50 is on par, perfectly average growth in relation to your academic peers, other students in the same grade level or year of school who began at roughly the same level of performance. So an SGP of 50 indicates that students are growing at a perfectly average kind of rate. Anything above 50 is above average. Anything below 50 is below average. And what you see here is a lot of numbers a little bit below 50, but not so terribly far below. Even in a normal year for a fairly large group of students, we could see an SGP median of 49, perhaps a 48. Not so many 47s, rarely if ever a 46 or a 45 or a 44. And so what we see is students are moving a little bit slower this year, but not too terribly far off the mark. The most concern for the middle grade students in reading, where you see the lowest SGPs or the lowest growth. So that's pretty good news, but let's start looking at some things that are perhaps a bit more concerning, because again, there are instances of students losing ground, holding ground, and gaining ground. Here is our best estimate of how students are performing in reading. The easiest way to interpret this chart is to go to the far right column where it says percentile rank. And what we're talking about is our estimate of the difference between how students typically perform in reading and how they are performing now. And we estimate that across the years that we were able to study grades 1 through 8, students are performing about 2 percentile points behind where they typically would have been. So a little bit behind, not too terribly far behind. It is important to understand, though, that this is as of the winter, and students began this school year at roughly 1 percentile point behind. So they have fallen from 1 percentile point behind to 2 percentile points behind. Again, not terribly, tragically far behind, but we should be very concerned about this additional slippage. Now, our report, basically every other report that I've seen on the US market and in the UK as well, virtually every report out there is saying it appears that mathematics has been more impacted than reading during the recent disruptions. And that is exactly what we saw. So you read this table in exactly the same way. It lets you know that we are estimating that on average, we believe students to be about 6 percentile points behind, with some grade levels being impacted a bit more, some a bit less. It's also a bit insightful to understand that as the school year began this year, students were 7 percentile points behind. So they were 7 percentile points behind. Now in the winter, we find that they are 6 percentile points behind. So in the case of maths, we are moving in the right direction. We have caught up a little bit of ground, but we still have a long way to go. If it has taken one full semester, the first half of the US school year, to move students from -7 to -6, then it would take several more years at this rate to get students back up to where they typically had performed. But perhaps the most alarming things that we saw were found when we went further behind the averages and began to break things down demographically. And I would describe what we saw in the demographic breakdowns as being somewhat stark. So here's the most concerning information that we found. I want to show you what to look for before I show you the entire table. I'm going to go back to the fall. We had a table in there in the fall that looked something like this. And if you haven't picked up on it already, in our report, anytime we are referencing mathematics, it is in green. Every time we're referencing reading, it is in blue. This table shows you that at the fall, we estimated students to be 1 percentile point behind in reading. We estimated them to be 7 percentile points behind in math overall. That's all students. But then if you took the student population, you broke it down by race and ethnicity, then you found that some racial ethnic groups were a little bit further ahead and some were a bit further behind. That's the way you read this table. We were able to add something to this in the most recent report, however. We could put a small f on each box that represents where students were in the fall. And then we could plot next to that box another one showing you where they were as of the winter. And when you look at the full table, which I will show you in just a moment, what you're hoping to see is exactly what you see in the example provided on the screen here. You were hoping to see that where students are in the winter is to the right of where they were in the fall, indicating that they're moving ahead. Movement to the right is moving ahead and growing. However, I will let you know that you will not see that for every demographic breakdown. You will see some instances where some subpopulations of students are now further behind in the winter than they were as the school year began in the fall. And so I put a small red arrow there because that is not what we want to see. That is rather alarming. So let me open up the curtains here and let you see. Here is reading. Now, again, you see some reference points there for you. You see where students were in reading overall in the fall at -1, where they were overall in the winter at -2. And then you see the light blue and dark blue boxes indicating where they were in the fall and where they are in the winter. And to assist you a little bit, I'll point out a few things. Here are 6 of the 16 demographic breakdowns, where we find that students are at the same place or at a higher level of performance. However, if this is 6 instances of students moving ahead, that gives us 10 instances where students are further behind. So students who are African American, Hispanic, American Indian, or Alaskan Native, students who are 2 or more races, students with disabilities, all excused or saw some drop in performance, as did English language learners, generally students who were in suburban schools and urban schools, public schools overall. And in the US, Title I is a federal program that is tied to income. So the more Title I you have in school, the higher your poverty rate is. And what this suggests is students who were in Title I schools experienced a bit more drop in students who were higher income. And so in reading, We saw some fair amount of slide when you broke things down demographically. And you would perhaps have anticipated this because I began with that SGP slide and I showed you that for reading, SGPs were a bit lower. Now, with maths, again, overall was at -7 in the fall, was now at -6 in the winter. You see the same 16 demographic breakdowns. The good news on the math side is there are 10 instances where students are at the same place or better. This is good news, but that leaves 6 instances where students are further behind now than they were when the year began. And what is particularly alarming is all 6 of these instances where students are further behind in maths represent demographic subgroups who are also further behind in reading. So again, African American, Hispanic, and American Indian students, students with disabilities, English language learners, and students in urban schools. And so we need to be very concerned about how we are meeting the needs of these students. And I encourage anybody listening to not only look at their overall averages of their student performance, but do everything you can to break down those averages, particularly if you serve a diverse mix of students. Because one of the most important lessons there is about statistics is that it's one thing to know the average, and it's quite another thing to look behind the average and understand the distribution of scores behind that overall average. Because as we see right here, sometimes there can be some stark realities hiding behind those overall averages. So just last 2 tables here from the report. How long would it take us to catch students up? Well, for each grade level here, you see again the light blue box and the dark blue box. The dark blue box lets you see where students are in the winter. And there's some fairly good news here. We see, for example, students in the primary grades are pretty close to expectations, somewhere in the range of about 3 or less weeks behind. Pretty close to there in grade 5, a little bit further behind, about 4 to 7 weeks behind for students in grades 4 and grade 6. And our late middle school grades, grades 7 and 8, where students are now estimated to be about 8 to 11 weeks behind. Now, remember, there's been some slide in reading, but reading was not as far behind as math. In math, we see instances where there's going to take a bit more time to catch up. So grades 2 and 3, students are pretty close to expectations in mathematics. Grades 4, 5, and 6, 8 to 11 weeks behind. And some good news for our late middle school grade students who are further behind in reading. They're actually a little bit further ahead than some of their counterparts in maths. They are roughly about 4 to 7 weeks behind. Now, to be clear, when I say that they are 8 to 11 weeks behind, do not interpret this as meaning that they are caught up after 8 to 11 weeks in school. No, when we say 8 to 11 weeks, what we mean is these students would have to receive a daily course in mathematics for a period of 8 to 11 weeks to catch them up, not to catch them up into a particular benchmark or to, pass any particular tests, merely to catch them up where students typically started the year. So clearly we have some ground to cover with students. How do we move faster? Well, I want to give you a couple of ideas about how you can go about addressing the academic challenges of the COVID slide. And the first one is a free tool that we have available to all schools. We refer to it as Focus Skills, and it provides you information about those skills that are the most important for progress in reading and mathematics. Now, I have 2 options on the screen here. You can either be guided by some US standards or some English National Curriculum standards. So if you prefer focus skills related to the English National Curriculum, go to renlearn.co.uk/focus skills with a dash between those 2 words. And if you'd rather look at a particular US state or perhaps the United States Common Core State Standards, which is the closest thing in the US that there is to a national curriculum, then you would visit renaissance.com/focus skills, again, with a dash between those 2. Let me just show you those 2 very quickly so you have a feel for what they look like. And so let me close this, and hopefully you're still seeing there. Confirm what I am sharing. Okay, you're doing fine. So here is the landing page that'll probably be the most appropriate for this audience. That is to go again to renlearn.co.uk/focus skills, where you can immediately download the teacher workbooks tied to the US, or excuse me, to the English national curriculum. And so if you click on this button here, you will be able to download the workbooks, and you will be able to see a list of the most important reading and math skills for progress. There is also a video here that explains to you what focus skills are, how they were developed, and how you can use them in planning instruction. But think of it this way: instead of saying, let's cover every single skill we would normally cover, this list of focus skills tells you the ones that we absolutely must cover, those things that are foundations or prerequisites for future learning. It's things that if we don't teach to students at a certain grade level or year level, there will be a gap in the future. If you prefer to be guided by US standards, and you go to the US landing page, you can use this drop down to choose a particular state. Unless you know of a particular state, if you're looking for the Common Core state standards, I'll use Delaware as an example because Delaware is a state that adopted the Common Core state standards and made no changes to them. On the US site, we have an interactive tool that you can work with to drill in and see these skills. And it allows you to call them up and explore them here in a bit more detailed way than we were able to do on the UK site. But just like the UK site as well, when you've drilled in and gone into that interface, or if you go to the map and choose a state, like little Delaware over here, once you click on it, it pops up and offers you the ability to get either a literacy or maths workbook. And so if I click on this, then what I will get is a listing of all the most essential mathematics skills for progress across all of the years of school. It contains some information on how these things were developed, how the domains and headings of the standards emerge across the year levels or grade levels, and how to use the workbook with instructional planning. And so we do not have time to go into tremendous detail here. Just like on the UK landing page, there's also a link to a webinar right here. It would provide you all of the information about how we develop the focus skills and how to use them for instructional planning purposes. So this tool will allow you to focus in on what matters the most, because we are trying to figure out the fastest path of stepping stones that we can take to catch students up. And the focus skills really can help you prioritize your time and your attention. I want to end with just a couple of ideas here. And the first one is this: the kind of growth that we would have needed to have seen to fully wipe away all the impacts that COVID made as the pandemic began, we have never seen in 1 year. In other words, there's never been an academic year of schooling where students grew at such a quick rate that we could have caught up from being as far behind as we started this particular school year. So the advice that I am offering to school leaders is to think about it this way: catching up from COVID is more of a marathon, a longer run, than it is a sprint. It's not like we could have run really, really quickly this year and covered all of that ground. It's going to take us a little bit longer. We're going to have to make our way through this school year, perhaps through the summer, do some extra things next school year, and perhaps the marathon may even continue into the summer of 2022. In the US, there's been a growing emphasis on summer learning, how we can keep students learning and engage with both reading and maths over the summer. And we are preparing for far more conversations around extended time options. Extending the school year or the school day for all students, or perhaps targeted time or additional time for targeted groups of students. Let me share one final resource with you. If you would like to survey the research on what is possible during summer learning experiences or during extended time or extra time experiences, one of my favorite websites to go to is the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK. If you simply Google Education Endowment Foundation, it will bounce back as your first search return. They have a very long URL, educationendowmentfoundation.org.uk. If you go to this website and hover over evidence summaries, they have an amazing resource here that they refer to as their teaching and learning toolkit. So these are fabulous research summaries on different instructional approaches. And they have one on extending school time is right here, and another one on summer learning or summer schools. And so if you click on either one of these sections of their toolkit, it will pop up with a very nice report, and they all have the same headings. What are we talking about? How effective is it according to the research? How secure is the evidence that we have from the research? What is it likely going to cost to implement? And then I personally love their what to consider sections, where they put forth some of the most important questions to consider. For example, when it comes to summer learning programs, getting high attendance rates, one of the greatest challenges there. So again, a bit more guidance for you on what to think about in terms of these different legs of the marathon we're running, research on summer learning and extra time. Also at both renaissance.co.uk and at renaissance.com, we have sections of our website devoted to summer learning experiences. And I believe one of my colleagues will be on the chat line that can paste in some of those resources for you. Because again, recovering from the academic impacts of COVID is more of a marathon than it is a sprint. And fortunately, in some instances, we are seeing more and more government funding, both in the UK and the US and in many other countries that can support extended time and summer learning experiences. Again, as I said, Education Endowment Foundation for their resources there. And I'll end with this. I believe that what we're seeing in the data, this idea that we're seeing a widening of student performance gaps when you bring things down demographically, is because one story has become multiple stories. This chart shows, at least in the US's experience, how quickly schools closed. Roughly 100,000 public schools in the United States, and they closed very quickly during COVID. Look at the period of between the 9th of March and the 17th of March last spring, when basically over just 1 week, 80,000 US schools went offline. And then the remaining schools closed over basically the next week. What this means is it didn't matter where you were in the US, and I think this experience probably played out in most countries. The COVID pandemic came upon us very, very quickly. And so in a period of just a week or two, in most instances, all schools were forced to close their doors to in-person instruction. Whether they were large or small, whether they were public or private, whether they were in the center of the city or in more rural areas, most schools had to close their doors last spring. And so students around the world and across our countries often had fairly consistent experiences from the beginning of the pandemic until this school year began. But I will tell you, at least in the US's experience, what has happened during the current academic year has varied widely according to where you were. Government guidance changed, and so schools began to do different things. And in some instances, schools were in person for learning all year long. In other instances, students have not been back in for in-person learning. And in some cases, when the schools themselves have reopened for full in-person learning, some parents are keeping their children home from school. So a tremendous amount of variety. One story, the initial impacts of COVID, has become many stories as each country and each territory in each state and each locality has dealt with the pandemic in very different ways. We appreciate your time. I believe that some of my colleagues will be on the line to assist you with your questions and answers. And again, please do reach out to us by either visiting renlearn.co.uk for most international customers and renaissance.com for US customers or American international schools that may be taking their lead from the US. We are standing by to assist you and help you as you make your way through making it back to the regularity that hopefully we're all seeing on the horizon. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to Utilising the VLE to inform assessment, intervention and progress. Thank you to Jean Cairns from Renaissance. My name is Barry Bridie and I am the Head of Maths and Assessment and Data Coordinator for Nord Anglia, Manila. Now, I'm in a unique situation at the minute because I'm currently in the UK been teaching online for a full year from Manila due to COVID, and it's currently at midnight because they are 7 hours in front. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about strategies that I've used in the classroom, and they can be adapted to many subjects. My presentation will incorporate these 4 areas: Jamboards, diagnostic questions, Google Sheets, trackers, and Google Docs. Now, because we have been teaching online for a full year, it is difficult to reciprocate the in-class experience, and we've done our best to try and do that. But it's not the same as being in the classroom and to be able to see the pupils' work very easily, ask questions. So by using these strategies, what I've tried to do is consistently assessing where the pupils are, what they understand, what they don't understand, and what's the next step, because I don't want them to lose that teaching for a year. And I know that some pupils can get lost in the virtual schooling. So we've tried our best to try and prevent that from happening. And I do feel that these tools have helped that. Now, Jamboard is like an online classroom. It's got the whiteboard experience. And what I use it for is to assess a piece of work or part of a unit. I'll put questions on there and pupils answer them in real time. Now, if they've got a tablet, they can either answer it directly, but if they don't have a tablet, then they can do the work in their book and then post a picture so that everybody can get involved. And I can mark it in real time, and that feedback is saved and they can go back and look at it. If it's a small problem, I can just instantly help the people, direct them to the Jamboard again and say, have a look at your Jamboard, look at my feedback. But also it lets me see if there's a common problem which I can address with the class. Craig Barton, diagnostic questions, and it's basically quizzes. What I like to do is I like to do a quiz maybe at the beginning of a unit to check for prior knowledge, or the middle of a unit, or just before a test. A lot of these quizzes are already made, and the idea is that there's going to be one correct answer and the other 3 answers are misconceptions. And what's good about this, you can see you've got the data here, how many people got the question right, and you can hover over that to see who got it right, and then you can see what the answer, who got B wrong, and you can see that 3 people got that. So what's the misconception? What do I need to address? And you can make your own quizzes, but following the idea that 1 question's correct, but 3 other answers are misconceptions. Google Sheets. Now, normally what I would do is I would just record a test result, as you can see in the left-hand side there, what the mark is, and the percentage, the grade. But because I am not in the classroom, I wanted to do a class analysis, and I've worked hard this year trying to make this spreadsheet so I can look at the class analysis and see, right, what do I need to work on, or what do the pupils struggling with, and how I would address that. I might address it through starter questions, homework, exit questions. So I can see here, looking at my analysis, that completing the square hasn't been done very well, and solving non-linear equations. So not only would I do a class analysis, each pupil would get a feedback sheet, which I'm going to look at here. And this is where the Google Doc comes in. So what we did do at the beginning is that every pupil had a virtual learning diary, and they had to put their work on it. But we were finding that it was taking a long time for every subject for pupils to constantly take pictures and then upload them onto the Google Doc. And sometimes if pupils did it correctly, then there was like 100 pages within about 5 or 6 weeks. And for me, that's not easy to spot where pupils are struggling. So this is why the Jamboard comes in, and then the Google Doc is just for those people to work on their feedback. So you can directly look that this person has got to evaluate powers of fractions, and then you go to the work and see, have they accomplished that? Have they done that work? And it's just to see if they're completing the loop. And this was a mock. It's good for mocks as well. And the class analysis, you can do it per class. You can look at set 1, set 2. You can see what the common misconceptions are in classes. And then you can actually use it as CPD opportunity, because you can maybe look at, oh, everybody got this right in this class. This other class of similar ability got it wrong. What does that teacher do to teach that topic, and can deliver CPD on it? I mean, the whole idea of this is that you're consistently analysing where the pupils are, and by doing a class analysis, individual analysis, and the next steps. And what you can do is, if you can look at a couple of pupils in a class who struggle with this, you can do breakout rooms, and each one of those groups can have different work associated with areas that they need to improve upon. And the last thing I was going to talk about here is moat. I've found that the marking can be quite heavy with virtual school, and the workload has increased massively. So using moat, which is a voice note, and you can, instead of typing out feedback, you can leave pupils a voice note and attach their name. And for me, it's a lot easier, and saves me a lot of time. And the pupils prefer hearing the voice note because it can be explained better. Okay, guys, thank you for listening to my talk. If there's any questions that you may have, or if you want further information on some of the stuff we've talked today, please don't hesitate to give me an email. Thank you very much.